Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. So here we have today Professor Deepti Goel from Azim Premji University. She did her PhD from Boston University and MA from Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi. So before joining Azim Premji University, Professor Goel worked at BSc, ILO, and IFMR Chennai, and her area of specialization are econometrics of impact evaluation and labor economics. And Professor Goel has published extensively in reputed journals, including Review of Development Economics, International Journal, Indian Journal of Labor Economics, World Development, World Bank Economic Review. And today she will speak on determinants of performance in high school performance in Delhi. So Deepti, it is for you now.
Yeah. Thank you, Bodhi. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all of you for participating in this presentation. So without much ado, I will start the presentation. Please feel free to unmute and ask clarificatory questions. And I believe I can go for 45 minutes and we can have a discussion after that. All right, so let me just share my screen. Okay. Slideshow. Is it visible? Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the title is Drivers of Student Performance in Delhi's Higher Secondary Public Schools. And this is joint work with Bidisha Barua, who currently works at the 3IE International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And this research was funded by the International Growth Center. So let me begin by telling you what is it that we are trying to address in this work. So there's lots more in the paper, and I can share the working paper with Bodhi if you're interested. But today's presentation will focus on three main questions. The first is, in the context of public education, higher public education in Delhi, what is the quality of teachers in our higher secondary public schools? So by higher secondary, let me clarify, I think for this audience, I don't need to, but nonetheless, for completion, higher secondary, we mean grades 11th and 12th, right? So one of the questions that we want to ask is there much variation in teacher quality in these schools, in Delhi's higher secondary public schools? So by public schools, I mean government schools. And why is this an interesting question to ask? For me personally, this is interesting because there is a perception among the public that that not much teaching happens in government schools, that private schools, for whatever reason, deliver better learning and better education than public schools. So one way to kind of see if this perception that the public holds is true or not is to ask the question that if you were assigned a different teacher when you were going through grades 11th and 12th, would it make a difference to your test scores? And if the answer is yes, that means the teachers are contributing to something, and therefore one must question this notion that most teachers in public schools are not doing their job, that this is perhaps not correct. So that's one question we ask. The other is, correspondingly, what's the variation in student quality? Okay. Do whatever student embodies, such as their family background, their caste, their gender, any fixed kind of trait of the student, does that matter for how well he or she performs in the board exams. And finally, once we answer these two questions, and if the answer is that there is substantial variation in teacher quality and there is substantial variation in student quality, then what are the markers of a good teacher, or what are the markers of a good student? So we are looking for observational markers here. How do we identify these people, good teachers and good students? Yeah. So let me pause now to see if my audience is with me and if there are any clarificatory questions, because I cannot lose you at this point. So are there any questions on what is it that we are trying to address in the paper? Okay.
Just to let you know, everybody, that if you have any question, you can either raise your hand or you can type if you want on the the panel on the right hand side. So we could take the question to Professor Goel from there.
Okay. Yes. I may not be able to see the chat, Bodhi. So if there's a question on chat, can you?
I will convey it to you.
Yeah. Okay. So then let me go on and please do ask me clarificatory questions, and we can take the substantial questions in the end. Okay. So again, a set of things that I'd like to clarify is in this paper, when I say a good teacher or a good student, what I understand from that, or how I measure it, is what is the ability of the teacher in terms of raising the students' test scores. Now we all know that a teacher brings much more to the table than simply improving the students' test scores, but with this limitation in mind, that we are only measuring a teacher's performance in terms of her ability to raise test scores, we will go ahead with this, because in the absence of a better measure, this is the best feasible measure that I could use to get at teacher quality. So this is a limitation. It is a limitation of the data, that we don't have other measures of measuring teacher performance. So for this work, we will understand a good quality teacher as someone who's able to raise a student's test score in the board examination in grade 12. So it's a very limited understanding of teacher quality, but it's perhaps the only feasible one that we could find. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move ahead. I won't spend too much time here, but just to highlight what we bring to the table in terms of what is our contribution to the existing literature in this area. So there hasn't been any work so far in terms of, these are called value-added measures, that is the teacher's ability to raise test scores, controlling for or taking into account a student's prior performance. That's why it's called value added. So what's the value addition that a teacher brings to the table? So there has been no prior work on value added estimates of teacher quality from public schools in India. There is a similar paper that looks at private schools, a set of private schools in Uttar Pradesh, but there is no work from the public domain, from the government school domain, and this is the first such paper. And for this audience, at least, I don't need to highlight why one must study public and private separately, because these are essentially two very different institutions. Public school teachers are well paid, private school teachers are not. Public school teachers, they have job security. In private, you don't have that. There is some papers that say that there's a lot more absenteeism in public schools and not so much in private schools. Public school teachers have higher educational qualifications, but they don't have as many teacher training certificates compared to private school teachers. So there are many and also let's not forget the kind of students that enroll themselves into these institutions. It's basically the very poor that stick with public education, and the better off go to private schooling. So, these are very different black boxes or very different institutions, and how learning unfolds within these institutions could potentially be very different. So it's important to focus on government schools, and it goes without saying, because this is highly subsidized education, we are talking about if we are looking at this black box and we can essentially understand the process of how education happens in these schools better, then we could perhaps address some of the limitations that may come out, and that would go perhaps a long way in improving opportunities for the poor. So in that sense, it's useful to undertake such an analysis. All right, the rest I will not dwell on in this presentation. Okay, so what is our population of interest? Again, to make that very clear, we are interested in studying all students in Delhi's government schools who appeared for the 12th board examinations in the year 2016. So that's our population of interest. The paper would be much richer if we could get data year after year, but unfortunately we don't have that access. So we are only going to look at 1 year's performance, and on the basis of that, try to measure what is the variation in teacher quality. Does teacher assignment matter in Delhi's government schools, or would the student anyway do as they have done if they would have got other teachers? Yeah, that's the main question. Okay, so we are also interested in, of course, the teachers that taught these students in grades 11th and 12th. Now that was our population of interest. What is the sample that we are going to use to study this population? So it's a sample of 22 schools. This is a map of Delhi, and the schools are marked here. And in all, there are about 800, almost 900 higher secondary government schools in Delhi. And we are essentially going to speak something about this population of schools using a small sample of 22 schools. And this is very much a convenience sample, which is quite obvious from the clustering, geographical clustering that you see on this map. For example, here is where I lived when I was living in Delhi. So these 3 schools were kind of, I was heavily involved in surveying them. Here in this area, a couple of my RAs lived, and this is also near D school. So I was also involved here. And then here, these are the places where some of my RAs lived. So it's very much a convenient sample. We had initially thought of doing random sampling, but for various logistical reasons, we could not, logistical and also getting permissions, we could not implement that. So we ended with a convenient sample. So the first question, if I am to make any claims that this is, the work that I'm doing is about all of Delhi, all of Delhi's public schools, then I need to convince my audience and myself that these schools, these 22 schools, look reasonably alike when one compares the characteristics of these schools with the characteristics of all schools in Delhi. So that's what I'll show you in the next slide. So the first column here is about our sampled schools, our 22 sampled schools. The second column is about non-sampled schools. And then there is the difference between these two. And finally, whether this difference is statistically significant or not. So if the p-values are very small, it's statistically significantly different. And if they're not, then it's just the differences you see are just can be delegated due to chance. Okay, so again, it's worthwhile looking at this slide, not just to kind of convince you that our sample is a fairly representative sample, but also to give you a flavor of what are the kind of schools that we are talking about. So there are about in the non-sampled schools, there are about 44% that are all girls schools, so higher secondary girls schools. There are 41% that are all boys, and there is 18% that's co-ed. Then the mean number of students per school is about 152 students per school. That's the mean. It has a high standard deviation of about 112. Then about 99%, so almost all of them offer the arts stream. About 70% offer the commerce stream, and about 30% offer the science stream. The pupil-teacher ratio in these schools are about 27 pupils or students per teacher. Then the pass percentage is about 90% in arts, 92% in commerce, and about 95% in science. Well, the mean marks doesn't make much sense, so I'm not going to speak about it right now. And then if you look at the p-values, the only place where it's significant at the 10% level is in school size, so number of students enrolled. And it seems like we disproportionately sampled smaller schools. So 109 students per school in our sample versus 151 in the non-sampled schools. But again, if you apply the correction that one should apply when testing multiple hypotheses, then this is not even significant at the 5% level. So it's the Bonferroni correction. So once you apply that, then this difference is not statistically significant. So in a nutshell, basically, this table should convince you that our schools do a fairly good job of representing the whole population of government higher secondary schools in Delhi. All right, then what are our data sources? There are two broad sources of data in this work. One is we did a number of primary surveys to collect data from students, from teachers, and principals. And then we did get a lot of data from administrative records in these schools. And what was the kind of data we dug up from administrative records? Well, it was the subject-wise marks in grade 10th and grade 12th. So I needed both sets of marks for every student, because what I'm studying is the value addition that a teacher brings starting from grade 11 to ending at grade 12 board exams. So I need both sets of marks. So we got this from administrative records and the timetable from each school so that we could know what are the teachers who taught each student in grades 11th and 12th. All right, so now coming to a little bit of the econometrics of what we do. So what is our goal? What we would like to do is, for example, compare two students who look at least observationally identical. Well, ideally, we would want them to be identical in all ways, and then just change the teacher assignment and see if that makes a difference to performance in the grade 12th exam. Okay, but we can't kind of do an RCT. We can't take a student and assign him or her a teacher, look at the performance, and then assign him a different teacher, look at the performance. We can't do this kind of an experiment. So we'll try to do our best in terms of comparing students that look very similar to each other, and the only difference is the teacher that taught them. Yeah, that's where we want to go. So how do we go about building that picture in a statistical fashion? So first we compare, we control for, or we account for the grade 10th marks of the student, which is basically a proxy to take into account that when entering higher secondary, these students may be at different levels of ability and different levels of performance. So their prior knowledge in some ways can be captured using their 10th grade marks. So that's one thing we do. So we account for that difference by controlling for it. The second thing we do is we have in our model, which I'll explain in a bit, we can control for unobserved time varying student ability. Now, this is a very tough thing to do in this literature. Now, how do you account for things that are not observable but time varying and could affect a student's ability outside of the teacher? So we are able to do that, and I'll tell you in a bit how. And finally, because of the rich data that we collected using our primary surveys, we are able to control for a number of varying inputs that a student may bring in that affect their test scores and outside of the teacher's contribution. So we are able to control for that as well. So specifically, we are able to control for whether a student is taking tuitions, how much time the student is spending learning by themselves outside the classroom, and what's the self-reported interest in that particular subject. Okay. This is just a broad eye view, and now I'll tell you the exact specification that we take to the data. So this is it. And let me begin by telling you what the subscripts are. So I stands for student, Z stands for subject, and J stands for the teacher. Right. So what is the outcome variable? This A12IZJ is basically the Z score. So we standardize all the marks. So we subtract the mean and divide by standard deviation so that the units are all in standard deviations. So this is the Z score of student I's performance in subject Z when taught by teacher J in grade 12. Yeah, so Z score, which is basically performance in the board exam by student I in subject Z when the subject Z is taught by teacher J. And here is where the control for prior learning comes in. We control for how much the student scored in grade 10 in that particular subject. Yeah? So that's why this has an IZ subscript. Then these are the varying student inputs. So the three specifically there are three of these. That is whether the student I goes for tuitions in subject C. That's one control, whether or not they do that. What is the self-reported interest of the student in that particular subject, and what's the self-reported time that they spend outside of the classroom trying to understand this subject. And then finally, these are the two fixed effects. This is a student fixed effect. So there's it's a stand-in for all time invariant characteristics of the student, the gender, the caste, family background, all of this, the inherent intelligence, all of that. And this is a subject teacher fixed effect. That's why ZJ. So I'll be calling this teacher effects in short, but actually these are subject teacher effects. So and of course U is anything not captured by the model. That's the residual. So essentially what we're doing is we are saying that for the same student, we are going to kind of look at how they perform in different subjects taught by different teachers, and that's how we classify these teacher effects. So it's within student across subjects. And that really goes a long way in allowing for student ability to vary over time, because that's not going to matter for us because we are measuring teacher performance using contemporary performance across multiple subjects. So that's what it is. So once we estimate the specification in the data, basically the standard deviation of these subject teacher effects or teacher effects is going to be a measure of teacher quality. Now, why is this a measure of teacher quality? Basically, when you have very different estimates of a whole range of different estimates of these teacher effects, it's basically telling you that different teachers are improving the performance differently, right? So if the standard deviation of this is very large, that basically says that there are good and bad teachers. There's a whole variety of teachers in the data. Whereas if the standard deviation of these teacher fixed effects were very small, then it could be one of two worlds. It could be a world where most teachers are very good, or it could be a world where most teachers are bad. Right now, I can't say which world that is, but that's what we're going to do. So we are going to measure the standard deviation of these effects, teacher effects, to say what's the variation in teacher quality in our data. And omega I, similarly, the standard deviation of omega I is going to tell you what's the variation of student quality in our data. Okay, I'll finish the slide and maybe then pause to see if there are questions. Let's see. Okay. I think okay. Also, because we have only one cohort of data, so only a single batch of students and their corresponding teachers, we cannot disentangle a school effect from a teacher effect, or even for that matter, a school effect from a student effect, because a given student is not moving across schools and a given teacher is not moving across schools. So what we measure is a within school variation in teacher effects. And so one has to keep this in mind, because this is a lower bound of the existing variation in teacher quality that's out there, because we're totally ignoring the between school variation in teacher quality. And there could be enough reasons, based on our understanding of the real world, to believe that this is not insubstantial, that even within the public schools, good teachers may be coming together in certain schools, and certain schools may be receiving only poor teachers. So we're looking at within school variation. And like I said, because we do a within student across subject variation in test scores after accounting for grade 10 performance, we've to a very large extent, we have controlled for non-random matching of students with teachers. Okay, and the final thing in terms of econometrics before I present the results is, some of you may wonder whether it's right for me to control for these student inputs. And why should you wonder? Because you may think that a given student may be going for tuitions because he perceives, whether it's true or not, but he perceives that the teacher for that particular subject is a weak teacher. And so to compensate for that weak teacher, the student goes for tuitions. And if I'm trying to measure teacher quality, then I would get an incorrect estimate if I were to control for tuitions, because going for tuitions itself is a reaction to the perceived teacher quality. But on the other hand, if you view these various student inputs as markers of heterogeneity, so this is like an omitted variable bias, then you want to control for it. So really the reality must be in between these two extremes. And so what we do as an empiricist is we present to you both specifications, one with controls and the other without controls. Okay, so maybe this is a good time to pause and see if there are questions.
Yeah, just one clarificatory question.
Yeah.
So do the student change schools like in your sample, or does it matter?
Oh, it would matter, but from my knowledge of schools and also visiting these schools, there's not much change happening once you enroll yourself in 11th. So there would be a change when you move from 10th to 11th in the school that you go to, but once you are enrolled in 11th, then basically till your 12th, you would stick in that school.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. So it's not an impossibility, but it's not big enough to warrant separate consideration in the empirical analysis. Okay. Okay, so then now getting into the nitty-gritties. So, again, I don't want to dwell too much into it because we don't have too much time, but data collection for this research study was just a complete nightmare. Starting from getting permission from the Delhi government to do it, to dealing with very low take-up rates for our primary surveys, it was just, I wouldn't embark on such a intensive data collection effort again, perhaps. Okay, so we ended up analyzing 1,733 students. And this is not all the students in these 22 schools. This is only about 80% of the students in these 22 schools. And so you would be correct to ask whether this is a representative sample of each of these schools. And we address that in the paper, and I'll show you in the next slide that again we don't have to be concerned that there's some kind of selection happening here in terms of who we analyze and who get left out. Well, we get all the teachers, so there's no problem there. And finally, our observations going by the empirical specification is a student subject teacher match. Yeah, and we have about 18,000 of those. Okay. So again, this is this actually is to give you a sense of that these 80% of the students are not a select sample, because how do we know that? So these are grade 12 scores. The first 3 columns have to do with grade 12, and the other 2 columns have to do with grade 10. So if you look at these numbers here, the first column, they're very close to 0. And these are the z-scores that we constructed for each subject using the mean and standard deviation for the whole population of students in those 22 schools. So given the way we constructed these z-scores, if we had everybody in our analysis sample, so instead of having just 80% of the students, if we had everybody, then this column should have been a column of zeros, and this column should have been a column of ones. But because we don't have everybody, we only have 80% of the people. This is close to 0 and this is close to 1. But if you stare at the slide, it's not way off. So that's our claim to saying that there's not a selection happening at this margin in terms of who we analyze. And let me tell you why we had to let go of these 30% students, or sorry, 20% students. It's because we were unsuccessful in getting the grade 10 records from the administrative records, or we could not do a matching of their performance with the grade 12 scores, because this was amusing, because there were many pujas in the same classroom. Now, if there are many pujas in the same classroom, then you really don't know which puja is this referring to. And many a times it was just the first name that was being recorded in some places. So, because of this very popular names, pujas, and puja was definitely one. There were a couple of these. We lost out some students, and these were the 2 primary reasons why we could not use 100% of the student sample. Okay, and now, I told you that we'd be controlling for grade 10 performance. So English could be matched with exactly the English scores in grade 10. Similarly, Hindi could be matched with Hindi scores. But for most other subjects, for example, economics, history, political science, all of these could only be matched with social science, because at the 10th grade level, you don't have, these specializations. Similarly, some amount of discretion for accounting and mathematics, we matched it with mathematics, and so on and so forth. So science for chemistry, physics, and biology, for all 3 of these, we matched with science. Okay, so now I'll show you the results. I'll start with showing you what's the variation in teacher quality, what's the variation in student quality, and because we are measuring both of these in the same context, we are able to also get a sense of, what matters more for performance in grade 12. Is it teacher-related factors, or is it student-related factors? And then finally, like I told you in the beginning, we try to look at observable predictors. There's nothing causal here of who is a good teacher and who's a good student. Okay, so these are the fixed effect estimates of teacher quality. Just give me a second. My daughter is here and I have to. Just give me a Okay, so this is Bodhi. Can you see my slides? Bodhi, am I back?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm really sorry for that interruption. Okay, so this is our teacher value added estimates. And you'll see that there are some negative estimates and there are some positive estimates. So what does this mean? So the negative estimates does not mean that these are bad teachers. All it means that in a relative sense, these teachers are doing worse than these teachers. So a negative doesn't mean that the teacher is harming the student, harming the performance of the student. It just means in a relative sense, he or she is bringing less to the table. So there is this variation in teacher quality that we plot, we find. And to give a number to it, when we control for student inputs, then the standard deviation of teacher fixed effects is 0.373. Now, again, to read this in simple English, what this means, this standard deviation of 0.73, what this means in simple English is that if you were to assign a teacher to a student whose performance is at the median. Okay, so if you were to assign a 1 standard deviation better teacher to a student whose performance is at the median, then that student's performance would move from the 50th percentile to the 65th percentile. So that's the kind of variation in the teacher body. So I'll just repeat that once because that's a key result. So what a standard deviation of 0.373 means is that if you were to assign a 1 standard deviation better teacher to a student who was at the median, then his or her performance would improve from being at the 50th percentile to being at the 65th percentile. So that's a huge improvement. In fact, in studies done in the United States, this variation in teacher quality is much lower. So this is a huge number in this literature, and it's actually comparable to what the other paper. Remember, I told you there's another paper that looks at the same question but for private schools. So this teacher quality variation is comparable to the variation in private schools. And so what I want to underline is the notion that most teachers in public schools are not doing their job or are shirkers can't be true if we see such a huge variation in teacher quality. Okay. Then what's the variation in student quality? Again, in terms of takeaway, it's much larger. Okay, it's 3 times as large. Because if you were a 1 standard deviation better student and you were at the median, you would be bumped up to the 79th percentile. So again, a takeaway would be that student factors matter much more than teacher factors for a given student. But one must also remember that if one improves things at the teacher side, then it's going to impact a large number of students because one teacher teaches a large number of students. And this result, by the way, again, is very similar to some papers for the UK to find that student factors matter much more. It's also similar to what the other paper, it's a paper by Azam and Kingdom, the one that looks at private schools. It's published in the Journal of Development Economics. So it's similar. Again, this result is similar to what's there in the literature elsewhere. Okay. And the remaining 3 slides basically are there to show you that in the primary surveys that we did among our teachers and our students, there wasn't 100% take up. So not all students participated in the primary survey and not all teachers did. Only actually about 70% of the teachers and students participated in these surveys. So again, one may ask, is there a selection happening? And basically the objective of doing these primary surveys was to get at what are the markers, observational markers of a good and a bad teacher, or a good and a bad student. So how do we see if there is selection or not, selection into our survey or not? We basically plot a kernel densities of the value added estimates of teacher quality for those who were in our survey, which is the blue line, and for those who did not participate in our survey, which is the red line. And as you can see, they overlap. So there is really, it's not as if only the high quality teachers participated in our survey or the other way around. There's almost, there's a very high overlap in the kind of teachers who participated or who did not participate in our survey. Similarly, you see the same thing for student. When you see it from in terms of student value added measures, student effects, again, there's a big overlap. Okay, now coming to the last bit, who are good and who are the good teachers and who are the good students? So in terms of teachers, these are the characteristics that we track. So we track the gender, or we know the gender of the teacher. We know whether the teacher is married or not. We know the religion, and we know the caste. Caste in terms of 4 broad categories: SC, ST, OBC, and general. Then we know whether the teacher has a postgraduate or not. We know if the teacher has some kind of training certificate. We know if the teacher is tenured, permanent or not, and we know the years of experience. And finally, we also did a personality test in our survey of teachers. So these are 5 traits that are captured by this personality test. And basically, this idea was: is it that the personality of the teacher kind of goes a long way in predicting whether they are good or bad? Because intuitively, the answer would be that it should go a long way in predicting teacher quality. And in terms of students, what are the observable characteristics of students that we track? The age, which is more or less, actually, there's not much variation, around 18 years of age. Gender, religion, caste, whether the parents graduated through, had a, were 12th pass or not. And as you can see, only about 38% of the students reported that their father had graduated from 12th. So this basically says that these are first generation learners, most of them. And some other characteristics. Okay. So what do we get from that analysis? And basically here, how do we come at these conclusions? We have essentially regressed the value added estimates of teachers on their observable characteristics to see whether these characteristics predict the teacher fixed effects, and similarly for students. And what do we find is that being permanent, so getting tenure, goes a long way in predicting teacher quality. So if you are permanent, the data is showing that you're more likely to be a good teacher, or your value added estimate is very high. And this is just conjecture from our side. So this could be happening because of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which basically says that if you want a person to perform at their potential, at their best, you must ensure that some of their basic needs are met, because only then they will have enough mental and physical capacity to devote to, excelling. And so if you consider job security as one of those basic needs, which in my books, I do consider it as a basic need, then this to me is not surprising. And the other explanation for this could simply be that whatever the procedure is which grants the permanent status, I believe it's clearing an exam, that acts as an effective filter in weeding out or in selecting good teachers. And this is, again, the second bullet point here is a result that is common across contexts worldwide, which is that gender, teacher training, teacher qualification, these things don't matter. I'm not saying personality traits, because there haven't been many studies to examine this. Teacher experience, I must add, there's mixed result across the world. Many papers have found that the initial few years of experience matter a lot, and there are other papers that have also found that actually experience matters all along, and even does goes a long way in predicting a good teacher. The later years of education experience also help in the teacher becoming better. And then there are some papers that have found that experience doesn't matter at all. So the mixed results regarding experience, but all other teacher traits really don't matter much. That's the consensus in the literature, and we find that here as well. Then from the student side, we find that when both parents are earning, it um, uh, it adversely affects students' performance. This could be a manifestation of income effects. So the fact that both parents are earning may reveal that this is really a family which is not very well off, because in the Indian context, it's the very poor that show high female labor force participation, or the very highly skilled women. And finally, it could also be because a mother staying at home, brings in something, makes a difference to the performance of the child, and that could be another explanation which is behind seeing this. And finally, surprisingly for us, parents' education, caste, religion, these did not correlate with students' performance at all. So the takeaway, and with that I will end, is that contrary to the belief that most teachers in government schools are not doing their job, we find substantial within school variation in teacher quality, indicating that there is a mix of poor and effective teachers within Delhi's higher secondary government schools. I think this is a huge result, because it takes that perception that people have about teachers in government schools. Very, I'm sorry. Sorry again for that interruption. Yeah, so this is a huge result, because it goes against this popular perception that people have about how government schools work. And finally, there is also a large variation in student quality within our government schools, within Delhi's higher secondary government schools, because we found that student factors matter much more than teacher factors. And finally, this is not coming from the paper, but some policy implications of our work. Basically, the existing status quo really is not acting as a good incentive to improve matters within our schools, because what is being rewarded is seniority, which doesn't matter, at least not in our data. Seniority and experience is being rewarded, and teacher qualifications are being rewarded, which don't matter in predicting a good teacher. So maybe some rethink on what can be done differently if you want to improve things. Perhaps the way teachers are evaluated can be rethought. And again, we are not advising here to bring about a drastic change, but to perhaps experiment uh, with some of these other ways of compensating teachers, but to experiment very incrementally and very carefully, because there's a lot of political economy implications for how teachers get rewarded. So I'm going to stop there. I actually am yeah, there you go. Yeah. So that's it. That's the paper.
Yeah.
I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. Thanks, Deepti, for this nice presentation. So if there is any question, you can please raise your hand, and or you can type the question if you want to. Amar, yes.
Yeah, here I have one question. We have found that training of the teacher is not correlated. Is it mainly because the training may be more or less similar across all the government teachers? Because if you compare it with private and government, then I think this variable can, because you say that the training of the private school teachers are much more. They have more certificates than the government teachers. So maybe the variation is not that much.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah. So in terms of econometrics, I don't remember. Maybe I can go back and check in my slide. You may be right, because I think some of this training is compulsory. So there may not be enough variation to pick up the effect of teacher training. Or it could simply be that the training is not effective. I don't know which of these two is the reason, but so your conjecture is as good as mine. But anecdotally, in talking to teachers, and this is just pure anecdotally, there isn't much variation in teacher quality. There's not. Sorry. There. Teachers are saying that the training wasn't very useful for them. But that's just anecdotal.
Any other question? Let's check on the YouTube. Anything on the YouTube? No. Yeah. So Deepti, I have a question. Maybe so in teacher quality, when you are measuring it, so wouldn't it also depend on how many students the teacher? So basically, the class strength.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose I am teaching in a large class, vis-a-vis I am teaching in a small class. So would that matter? I mean, so if I'm teaching in a small class, I am more effective, right? In a school where intake is small, something like that.
Yeah. So yeah. No, I mean, from our experience, we know as teachers that it matters. The class size matters to how much learning happens within the class. So for me personally, I mean, that's a no-brainer from my own experience. But here we are identifying teacher effects using within student variation in performance across subjects, right? So in that sense, we've taken into account classroom effects. Like classroom effects get observed in the student fixed effects. So econometrically, in some sense, we've accounted for whatever effect classroom size may have when we are trying to estimate this variation in teacher effectiveness. Does that help you?
Yeah. And when was this survey done? Sorry, I may have missed this.
This was done. The surveys itself happened in January, February of 2016, and the board exam results that we are using are 2016 board exam results.
Okay. Fine. Yeah. Any other question? Anybody else? Yeah. So if you don't have, yeah, I think, yeah, Sambasiva, yeah. Sambasiva, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me, ma'am? Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
This is one question is regarding like now that we see Delhi government is increasing its expenditure on education, especially schools. So does that have any effect on rising test score or school infrastructure that indirectly rise? I mean to say increasing. Yeah, go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. Yeah. No. So that is a very relevant and important question to answer. But that's not our question. Because remember what we are doing is when this 2016 data, this is under the ARP regime. So the UP government had come in by then, and some of these, the measures that they're taking, and again, anecdotally, um, uh, teachers are saying that these are good steps to take, um, but that's just anecdotal. So the UP government was in place when we are doing our work, but remember, we are looking at teacher and student performance who are all in the same regime. Okay, so to answer your question, in some sense, at the very least, we need to, if we want to answer your question, which is how effective are the measures that AAP is taking or the new government is taking, um, how effective they are, we need more data, right? We need data with these measures in place and data without these measures. Otherwise, how if we only have data on how students perform when these measures are in place, we can't answer your question. So yours is an important question, but we are not answering it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else? Anybody else? Okay. So if there are no more questions, I think we can log off for today. Thanks, Deepti. Thanks a lot for this nice and illuminating presentation. And maybe if you just share your working paper with us, right, with me, then
Yeah.
I can,
Yeah.
there are a couple of students I know working in education and, maybe interested in the same type of questions, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
I'll definitely do that, and thank you for organizing this, and thank you all of you for coming for it. And I'm really sorry about the the interruption that happened. I just couldn't help it. So thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Goel. It was extremely engaging. I really enjoyed the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.